He could stop a punch before it landed and throw one before anyone saw his hand move. He built an entire philosophy of combat from scratch, tore down the walls of a segregated martial arts world, and turned himself into the first Asian leading man Hollywood had ever taken seriously. Then, at 32 years old, at the peak of everything he had worked for, Bruce Lee lay down for a nap in a friend's apartment in Hong Kong and never opened his eyes again. For half a century, that single fact, a healthy, disciplined, famously fit man simply dying in his sleep, has refused to make sense to anyone who has looked at it closely. This is the story of how he got there, the fight that may have set him on his path, the scandal that swallowed his final hours, and the medical detective work, decades later, that finally pieced together what his body could no longer survive. Bruce Lee entered the world on November 27, 1940, in a hospital in San Francisco's Chinatown, born to two touring performers from a Hong Kong opera troupe who happened to be passing through California at the time. It was, in a strange way, the first accident of geography that would shape his entire life. A birth on American soil to parents who had no particular intention of staying, which meant that from his very first breath, Bruce belonged to two countries at once without fully belonging to either, under the Chinese zodiac. He arrived in the year of the dragon, a detail his family took seriously enough that it shaped the stage name he would later use in Cantonese cinema, one that translates roughly to Little Dragon. His given name carried its own quiet wish from his mother, a hope buried in the meaning of the name itself, that he would someday return to the country of his birth. That return would take more than 20 years. Only months after he was born, his family sailed back to Hong Kong, arriving just before the territory was plunged into the chaos of the Second World War. Japanese forces occupied the city before the end of 1941, and for the next 4 years, Bruce's earliest memories were shaped by rationing, fear, and a childhood spent under military rule rather than in playgrounds. It was not the kind of start that produces a global icon, but it did produce someone who understood from the earliest possible age that comfort was not guaranteed, and that survival required adaptability. He was, almost by accident, a screen performer before he could walk, carried as an infant into a scene of a Cantonese film his parents were involved with. By the time he was 9, he was carrying real dialogue in a movie built around a well-known local comic strip character, and by 18 he had already appeared in roughly 20 Hong Kong film productions. While most teenagers were still deciding what they wanted to be, Bruce Lee already had a decade of professional acting behind him. None of that fame translated into a stable home. His father struggled with an opium addiction through much of Bruce's adolescence, and the household strain showed up in Bruce's schooling. He moved from one school to another after clashing with teachers and administrators, eventually landing at a Catholic secondary school where his intelligence was obvious, but his patience for rules was not. At 13, a friend introduced Bruce to one of Hong Kong's most respected Wing Chun instructors, a decision driven less by ambition than by necessity. Bruce had been getting into fights on the street, and his friend hoped discipline might channel that energy somewhere useful. But when Bruce first showed up looking to formally join the school, he was turned away, and the reason had nothing to do with talent. His mother's ancestry was part Chinese and part European, and in the eyes of some traditionalists in the Hong Kong martial arts world, that made Bruce an outsider undeserving of instruction reserved for full-blooded Chinese students. It took the intervention of the friend who had brought him there to convince the master to make an exception, and even after that, several of the other students resented training alongside someone they considered impure by bloodline. Bruce ended up receiving much of his instruction privately, alongside only a small handful of students who didn't share that prejudice. It was an early, formative lesson in exclusion, one he would spend the rest of his career actively working to reverse. He trained with an intensity that bordered on obsession, treating every session as something closer to a calling and a hobby, all while his appetite for street conflict kept growing. In 1958, a rooftop confrontation with rival students from another Hong Kong martial arts school ended with Bruce knocking a boy's tooth loose after being struck first. The victim's family went to police, and it was serious enough that his mother had to personally take responsibility at the station to keep the matter from escalating further, all without telling Bruce's father what had happened. That same year carried both consequence and triumph. Bruce won Hong Kong's interschool boxing title, defeating the reigning champion by knockout in the final round, proof that his skills weren't limited to Chinese martial arts styles alone. He also picked up a citywide cha-cha dancing championship around the same period, a strange but telling detail about how broadly his physical talent extended. But the rooftop fight had convinced his parents that Hong Kong had become dangerous territory for him. Either the law or a rival's grudge was going to catch up with him eventually. At 18, they sent him alone to the United States, the country where he had technically been born but had never really lived. He landed first in San Francisco with his older sister, then made his way north to Seattle, where he enrolled in a technical high school to finish his education, while working as a live-in waiter for a family friend who ran a restaurant. His days were consumed by labor and study in roughly equal measure, but in whatever time remained, he began teaching what he had learned in Hong Kong, a personal variation on Wing Chun that he was already reshaping into something of his own, later giving it the name Jun Fan Gung Fu. His first student was an African-American practitioner at judo, who was struck immediately by Bruce's precision and speed, and from there his small following began to expand. What set his classes apart in the early 1960s wasn't just his skill, it was who he was willing to teach. At a time when many Chinese martial arts schools accepted only Chinese students, and plenty of American schools were informally segregated along other lines, Bruce opened his doors to anyone serious about learning, regardless of race. Black, white, Latino, and Asian students trained side by side under him, an arrangement that was genuinely unusual for the period and reflected something Bruce believed deeply, that martial arts belonged to whoever was willing to put in the work, not any single ethnic group. In 1961, he enrolled at the University of Washington, officially majoring in drama, but frequently describing philosophy as the subject that shaped him most. He lived on very little money, took odd jobs to cover rent, and kept refining his martial art in whatever hours were left. Somewhere in that period, his personality, confident, restless, magnetic, began drawing people from very different backgrounds into his orbit, some of them from far wealthier circles than his own. The moment that pushed him from local curiosity to national name came in 1964, when he was invited to demonstrate at a major karate championship event in Long Beach, California. He stunned the crowd with two-finger push-ups, balancing his entire body weight on a single thumb and forefinger, and with a strike thrown from barely 6 inches away that sent a much larger man stumbling backward. It wasn't just spectacle. It was proof that everything he had built in private training actually worked in front of an audience. By the time Bruce reached his mid-20s, he had become impossible to ignore on the West Coast martial arts scene, largely because of a stance many traditionalists found genuinely offensive: his conviction that Chinese martial arts should not be restricted to Chinese students. According to his wife Linda, a group of Chinese martial arts elders in San Francisco grew increasingly frustrated by Bruce teaching outsiders what they consider protected knowledge. When he refused to change course, the community reportedly arranged a challenge match to settle the dispute, pitting Bruce against a martial artist newly arrived from China named Wong Jack Man. The match took place in 1964 in Bruce's own school in Oakland, with no cameras and only a handful of witnesses present, which is precisely why no two accounts of what happened have ever fully lined up. Linda's version has a fight ending in roughly 3 minutes, with Bruce pressing forward aggressively until Wong, unable to keep pace, effectively conceded. In her telling, Bruce was frustrated afterward not because he'd lost, but because a fight he expected to end almost instantly had dragged on far longer than he thought it should have. A different witness, a martial artist named William Chun, who was present that day, remembered something closer to 20 or 25 minutes of largely inconclusive exchange, with neither man landing a clearly decisive blow, and Wong reportedly holding back some of his stronger techniques out of restraint. In Chen's recollection, it read more like a draw than a decisive victory for either side. Wong himself told yet another version years later, claiming Bruce opened the encounter by feigning a handshake before launching an attack, and describing Bruce's approach as frantic and overly aggressive rather than technically controlled. In Wong's account, it was Bruce who tired out first, and the fight ended because of that exhaustion rather than any surrender on Wong's part. Wong later published an open challenge for a rematch in a local paper, hoping to clear his name after word spread that he had lost badly, but Bruce never responded, and no rematch ever happened. Whether that silence reflected quiet confidence or reluctance to risk a second, less favorable outcome is something nobody has ever been able to settle definitively. What is not in dispute is the effect the fight had on Bruce's thinking. He came away from it convinced that the rigid, tradition-bound structure of classical martial arts, including the Wing Chun he had trained in for years, was too limited to rely on in an unpredictable real fight. He began studying boxing, fencing, and wrestling with the same intensity he'd once reserved for Wing Chun, hunting for whatever actually worked rather than whatever was traditionally sanctioned. That search became the foundation of the martial art he would eventually name Jeet Kune Do, a system built explicitly around discarding anything that didn't function under real pressure. Hollywood would later dramatize this rivalry in the film Birth of the Dragon, inventing a friendship and a shared final battle against a common enemy that never actually happened. The real story was far less cinematic. Two men who represented two opposing philosophies, one rooted in preserving tradition, the other in tear it apart to find something better. By 1973, Bruce Lee was no longer a regional curiosity. He was becoming the biggest action star in the world, on the strength of a string of Hong Kong hits and a Hollywood co-production, Enter the Dragon, that was about to make him a household name across continents most of his early students could never have imagined reaching. On July 20th of that year, he arrived at the Hong Kong apartment of a young actress named Betty Ting Pei to go over script revisions for an unfinished project called Game of Death. His producer, Raymond Chow, had been present earlier in the day and later described Bruce as in good health and good spirits. At some point that afternoon, Bruce mentioned a headache. Betty offered him a common Hong Kong painkiller, a combination tablet mixing aspirin with a mild tranquilizer. He took it, said he wanted to lie down, and went to rest in her bedroom. He never woke up. The death of a man widely regarded as one of the fittest human beings on the planet, at only 32, would have generated shock under any circumstances. That he died in a young actress's apartment rather than his own home, with his wife Linda and their two children elsewhere, guaranteed something far messier than shock. It guaranteed scandal. Newspapers seized on a location almost immediately, less interested in the medical facts than in the implication of an affair. Betty Ting Pei spent years defending herself against rumors she always denied, insisting publicly that she and Bruce were professional collaborators who had first met through Raymond Chow the year before, and that she had even been introduced to Linda directly. In a television interview roughly a decade after his death, she described the years of suspicion as having cost her enormously, expressing frustration that the speculation was unfair not only to her, but to a man who was no longer alive to defend himself. No evidence of an affair was ever produced, but the story stuck to her for the rest of her public life regardless. Stripped of the tabloid noise, the actual medical question was simpler and stranger. What killed him? The initial ruling attributed his death to cerebral edema, swelling of the brain, triggered, doctors believed at the time, by an unusual and rare allergic reaction to the tranquilizer component in the painkiller Betty had given him. It was technically an explanation, but it satisfied almost no one. Bruce was young, athletic, and had spent his entire adult life pushing his body harder than almost anyone else in his field. A headache pill causing a fatal brain swelling in someone like that felt, to many observers, like an answer that raised more questions than it closed. One detail that didn't circulate widely at first only deepened the mystery. 2 months before his death, while working on Enter the Dragon, Bruce had collapsed on set after complaining of a headache and dizziness. He was hospitalized, treated, and recovered, with tests at the time reportedly showing signs of brain swelling similar to what would eventually kill him in July. There's little indication that this earlier episode triggered any serious long-term medical follow-up once he appeared to bounce back, a warning sign that, in hindsight, seems to have gone largely unheeded. The autopsy also found trace amount of cannabis in his system, which fed a wave of speculation that drug use had somehow caused the swelling. A British pathologist brought in to consult on the case pushed back on that theory fairly firmly, noting that while cannabis can affect the body in various ways, there was no credible medical basis for it causing cerebral edema or sudden death in an otherwise healthy adult on its own. Still, the combination of an unconventional death scene and a drug reference in the coroner's report was more than enough to keep conspiracy theories circulating for decades. A more physiologically grounded theory emerged later from one of Bruce's biographers, who pointed to a cosmetic surgery Bruce underwent in 1972 to remove his underarm sweat glands, a procedure he apparently pursued so he wouldn't visibly perspire on camera. Some medical observers have argued that a significant reduction in sweat gland function could meaningfully impair the body's ability to regulate its own temperature, particularly in a climate as hot and humid as Hong Kong summer. Under that theory, Bruce may have been functionally unable to cool himself properly during his notoriously intense training sessions, setting the stage for heat-related complications that could plausibly produce the same headache and collapse pattern seen in both his May and July incidents. The theory that has gained the most traction in recent years, however, came from a team of Spanish kidney specialists who published their analysis in 2022. Reviewing the available medical history, they propose that Bruce may have died from a severe case of hyponatremia,